Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Going on? Welcome back to the Social Studies. So today we're going to be covering a time right after the Civil War, when we are trying to reintroduce the Confederate States back into the Union, and we're going to be talking about what's going to happen with the newly emancipated. So this period of time is called Reconstruction. When the Civil War ended in 1865, there were so many questions left to be answered about the South and what Lincoln was going to do about the end of the Confederacy. So all of the pain that was felt across the country, now the nation had to face the uncertainties of the terms that the rebellious states were going to be able to re-enter the Union, and who's going to establish these terms. Okay, what's going to happen to Confederate leaders? Would it be President Lincoln that did something, or was it Congress? Now that the war was over and the slaves had been emancipated, what would happen to them? Who would protect them? What would they have equal rights as white people? Would they receive the same benefits of being a U.S. citizen? So this is the type of things, or these are the type of things that people and Congress and government were trying to figure out after the Civil War. And this time period is referred to as Reconstruction. And Reconstruction refers to the period following the Civil War in which there is the rebuilding of the United States by allowing the rebellious Confederate States back into the Union. So the war on the battlefield is over, but the war is now going to rage on in government and in Congress and the citizens in the North who want to severely punish the South, and Southerners are just trying to preserve what little life they have left. So this was the period of presidential Reconstruction, and it lasted from 1865 to 1877. Now, when we talk about presidential Reconstruction, we talk about two different plans, and we'll get to that in a second. So when Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, ending the Civil War on April 9th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was still the president, and he needed to put a plan into place to readmit those rebellious southern states and to deal with the Confederate traders and citizens of the South. So since 1863, Lincoln had been working on this plan, and he called it the 10% Plan. Lincoln wanted to restore the order quickly, and even some of the southern states were ready to comply by the end of the war. And Lincoln believed that the southern states could be reformed or readmitted back into the Union once 10% of its voters who were registered in the election of 1860 swore an oath of allegiance to the Union and agreed with the government that slavery was illegal. And once the 10% of Southerners swore their oath, then you could put new state governments in the South, forming new state governments, and voters could elect delegates and revise a new state constitution. In regards to the Confederate Army, Lincoln's 10% plan punished high-ranking Confederate officers like generals and such, and government officials, congressmen, senators. And to all the other Southerners, Lincoln offered amnesty or a pardon and guaranteed to protect private property, excluding the slaves. Many of the moderate Republicans who wanted a quick end to the war and wanted the healing to begin, they supported Lincoln's plan. Unfortunately for Lincoln, though, he could never see his plan put in place or to its full potential, because April 15th, 1865, 6 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater while he was watching a play. So in comes this guy. After Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president would be his successor. Andrew Johnson became president of the United States. Now, Andrew Johnson was a Southerner. He was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, and his plan was vastly different from Lincoln's 10% plan. Johnson's plan showed a very lenient policy in dealing with the South. Under Johnson's plan, all Southerners were pardoned of their war crimes, including high-ranking officers and government officials. Basically, all they needed to do was ask. Johnson also appointed a provisional or temporary governor to lead each state and issued steps to create new state governments, even though they still had to declare slavery was illegal. So the new governors would be the same wealthy white people that were in charge of the South before the Civil War, which really angered Northern congressmen. Congress tried to refuse some of the states from re-entering the Union due to the provisional governors that were put in place, and that even drove the question, what's going to happen to the newly emancipated or the freed slaves? Under Johnson's plan, the 13th Amendment was ratified. That freed the slaves, but it didn't give them any rights. Johnson believed it was up to the individual states, and they should decide how it was going to treat the free black people that resided in their borders. Southern governments would return to a previously used set of laws to control the freedom of slaves in the South, called the Slave Codes, and they just basically renamed them the Black Codes. So Black Codes were put into place to control the new freedoms of Southern blacks and attempted to keep former slaves from working free of economic gain. They didn't want them to gain money. Black Codes angered many Northern Republicans who felt that instituting the codes would allow the South to return to its old ways. And the Northerners hoped that the Southern states would not be forced to follow the laws. However, the return of white supremacy in the South spread, and for the recently freed, a post-war South was very similar to the pre-war South. Enter the Radical Republicans. The election of 1866 brought the rise of the Radical Republicans. They were voted into Congress with a 2/3 majority, and that was important. This gave them the power to pass Reconstruction laws with minimal to no resistance. Led by that guy right there, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, these new Republicans took a much harsher stance against the South, urging the president to severely punish the South, prevent the ruling class from continuing power, and force the change in the South. These radical Republicans felt that the Black Codes were cruel and stressed the importance of the federal government taking the lead in Reconstruction, and Johnson wouldn't have that. The new Congress was also instrumental in passing the heart and soul of Reconstruction. In 1867, they passed the first of several military Reconstruction acts, and it was these acts that effectively drove the efforts of Reconstruction and made it all possible. Without these acts, there would be no Reconstruction. The Military Reconstruction Act of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts and placed a Union military commander in control of each government with an outline on how the Southern governments would be designed. The military would remain in control of the South until the Southern states rejoined the Union. Now, under the control of the military, free black gained the rights to be citizens, males earned the right to vote, become judges, and even hold public offices like congressmen and senators. Southerners were furious that these African Americans would hold the same office that formerly belonged to Southern white Democrats like their former president, Jefferson Davis. So President Johnson would attempt to veto all the Republican initiatives, but Congress fought back and overrode the veto because of their 2/3 majority. That's why that was important. These radical Republicans would impeach President Johnson in 1868 when the vote passed the Senate by 1 vote, but was unable to convict him of wrongdoing, so he stayed in office and he had very little power. So what's impeachment? Impeachment is it's a charge of misconduct against the holder of a public office, and in order for the radical Republicans to attempt more Reconstruction initiatives, they needed to find a solution and get rid of Andrew Johnson's veto capability. Congress tried passing laws that limited Johnson's power, but when he fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Congress felt that he broke the law and decided to bring the charges against the president. The House of Representatives voted to impeach Johnson, and like I said, it passed the Senate by 1 vote. However, because of this lack of conviction, Johnson stayed in office with his power greatly reduced, and because of this, he decided to run against the re-election in 1868. So what was life going to be like in the New South? Newly freed slaves faced a number of problems. The slave codes prevented them from getting an education, so many of them couldn't even read or write. There was a very limited amount of job opportunities because most of the emancipated had skills in manual labor on farms, not running the farm. One of the final problems that needed solving was the newly freed slaves had no property, they had no money, they had no clothing, no tools, anything like that. So what types of jobs could the newly freed take? This is where this sharecropping comes in. So many of the freed slaves remained on their plantations and worked as what we call sharecroppers. The plantation owners couldn't afford to hire any workers to work their farms, and very few of the African Americans could afford to buy or rent any land, so sharecropping was the final result. And what it was is when the plantation owner or the landowner would allow the freedmen to work the land and give a portion of their harvest back as payment. And that portion was required to take off the quote-unquote land usage, and was usually pretty high, and it was difficult for the freedman to save enough of the crop to sell for his own profit. Many times a freed person had to purchase seeds, food, supplies, tools, and such like that on credit from the landowner, and then he had to repay that credit with a larger portion of the harvest. So sharecroppers would rarely ever get out of debt in this vicious cycle that they would be in, and they would constantly owe the plantation owner money. Some sharecroppers, however, were able to work and save enough money to purchase like a mule, or even lease or buy the land from the plantation owner to farm for themselves. They were called tenant farmers. They were basically one step above a sharecropper. However, the land was leased, it wasn't purchased, and they were also in a continuous debt of cycle just like this here. The sharecropper is provided the land and the seed. In exchange, he promises to give the half the crop. The sharecropper buys the food and clothing on credit from the landowning store. Then he plants and harvests. Then he gives the landowner his crop that he owes him, and then sells the rest. But then when he tries to settle up, the owner says, oh, you owe more money. And then to pay off that debt, he's going to give him more of the share of next year's crop, basically putting him back into this cycle of debt. Now, many churches actually tried to help the sharecroppers in the South, and because of that, memberships flourished in the churches to about 500,000 members during Reconstruction, so that was big. So what was going on in Southern politics? The demographics of Southern politics also changed during Reconstruction. The radical Republicans controlled most of the Southern governments and were very unpopular with the Democratic white Southerners. People called scalawags and carpetbaggers would then infiltrate the Southern governments, evicting those old Southern leaders. So a scalawag is another name for a scoundrel, and they were a Southern-born white person who belonged to the Republican Party who gained public office. There were mixed motivations for these scallywags. Some wanted to industrialize the South. Some wanted, most of them opposed slavery and secession. Others wanted to seek some office. They were office seekers. They wanted to seek office. And they wanted to take offices away from African Americans. And sometimes they did that by stuffing the ballot boxes. The other type of person is called a carpetbagger, and these were northern-born Republicans who moved south after the war, and they're called carpetbaggers from those pictures of the people walking like that guy on top there, carrying a carpet on his back filled with all of his goods, and it was rolled up. And they went to work in the governments in the South. They also had some different motivations. Some of them were teachers and clergy members who wanted to help former slaves. Others were former Union soldiers who wanted to return to the warm climate of the South they experienced during the war. And some were just business people seeking a profit. So what's the effect of these carpetbaggers and scalawags? Well, they had an effect on the Southern governments, and what they did was they took away political power from people like this guy here, Hiram Revels. He was the first African American in the U.S. Senate who represented the state of Mississippi. The whole intention of Reconstruction was to create a Southern government that had many African American representatives, but the scalawags and the carpetbaggers both denied this from them. So next we're going to talk about the Freedmen's Bureau.